So we would like to welcome you very much to today's talk, the second of our Greater Indus row. And today we have Professor Jennifer Bates speaking together with Professor Marco Madella. And their topic is Understanding Ancient Agriculture of the Indus Valley Civilization, Challenges and Potentials, what we know and why this is important, but also with problems. Now, I will first briefly introduce the speakers to you, and then they will have their talk, and we kindly ask you to ask questions after the minutes. So Professor is Assistant Professor of Archaeological Sciences at Seoul University and in charge of the Archaeobotany and Wet Chemistry Lab. She gained her PhD dedicated to the interactions between villages and cities during the Indus urbanization and deurbanization period in northern India in 2016 at Cambridge, and then went on to postdocs at Cambridge, Brown, and UPenn before joining Seoul National University in 2021. Her research focus includes the prehistory of South Asia, with interests in how people engage with their environments, food resources, and economic, social, and climatic surroundings. To investigate food waste, agriculture, and climatic change, she works with plant remains, both macrobotanical and microbotanical. She ran the Indus Border Project, exploring the relationship between the core of the Indus and the peripheral sites in its borderlands, but also worked in Malta and Libya on food and plant trade, nutrition, and climate change. At present, she is heading the Ash Mounds and Indica projects. Marco Madella is research professor in environmental archaeology at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. His background is in archaeobotany, environmental archaeology, prehistoric landscapes and land use, as well as socio-ecological dynamics of the Indus Valley Civilization. He is working in past vegetation histories, the modeling of and simulation of processes in human environment systems, the domestication of landscapes, and the origin and resilience of agriculture. After obtaining his PhD also in Cambridge, he was a research fellow at the McDonald's Institute for Archaeological Sciences and then the director of studies at Edmonds University. He was elected ICREA research professor in 2005 by the Spanish National Research Council and moved on in 2015 to the Universitat Pompeu Fabra. He headed three major projects in South Asia: the Herders Monuments, a survey of the South Indian Neolithic ash mounds with Ravi Korisetar, the North Gujarat Archaeological project with Ajit Prasad, and currently the modeling the agricultural origin of South Asia urbanism with Professor Abro, that is excavating medium-sized settlements in the core of the Indus Plains. And in addition to South Asia, you also worked in West Asia and the South Americas and has been or is still teaching at various universities. The many publications of these two experts and information on the numerous projects, also of last week's speakers, can be found on the internet and in their academic profiles. Please, we are looking forward to hearing your talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that glowing introductions, and thank you for inviting us to speak. And we're going to be switching backwards and forwards. So Marco is in charge of the PowerPoint. So I'm going to ask him to change the slides as we go. And as has been said, we are speaking on the agriculture of the Indus Civilization. So I'm going to begin, and I'm going to ask Marco to change it to the next slide for me.
Okay, we already start. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Marco. So what I'm going to do is set up the structure briefly for us, and say that before I just mention this, one thing that we're going to say just to head up this topic is that we've decided to talk on agriculture, and as we are both archaeobotanists, we're being very strict to the definition of Harris when he defines agriculture. And that is to say that we're going to talk mainly about plants. So the plant side of agriculture, because that's what Harris says it is, and that's our specialty. So we apologize in advance to the zooarchaeologists that are in the crowd, and anyone interested in the animal side of things. And perhaps that's something we can bring up in the question and answer. So what we're going to do in this talk is discuss the ecological context in brief, because last week, Dr. Cameron Petrie and Dr. Carlo Angelotti set that up very well for us. And then we're going to go into the traditions of archaeobotany in South Asia and the Indus more specifically, to really define how we've got to this position where we have a data set we can discuss. We'll look at what has been found, where it's been found, and how it's been found, in order to think about some of the trends and debates that we have within Indus archaeobotany and how these affect the discussions in Indus archaeology more generally. And we're going to use some case studies that are historic, so older, but also some current ongoing work that's happening that is expanding on these themes and the challenges we have. And we'll end by summing up what we think the big issues are and how these need to be handled. Thank you, Marco. Perfect. So one of the things we just want to head up before we begin any further, a next sort of point, is that not everything we're going to present here is solved. We're going to pose some problems throughout this presentation that may frustrate. We might not have all the answers to. So please bear with us, and we welcome constructive advice and suggestions. And frequently when either myself or Marco say we, this typically references we, the archaeobotanical community, rather than we, me and Marco. We want to, me and Marco, acknowledge the many, many people doing the work of archaeobotany in the Indus, and say that this is simply a summary of a small part of this huge work. So if the talk misses a citation or doesn't reference a specific case study or site, it's not a reflection on that analysis. It's simply that there isn't enough time to highlight everything, because this is a sign of the healthy data set and field that we have. Archaeobotany in the Indus is a growing area. So please note that this is not our work, it's the work of a collective, a large community. Thank you, Marco. So to briefly outline the ecology and the social context, building from what Cameron and Carla said last week, we'll keep it simple here. We have a large number of sites now known for the Indus, spanning a vast area. But the predominant amount of work has been done only on a few of these. And historically, this is centered around urban spaces, particularly places like Harappan. But increasingly, this is changing. The shift in archaeological focus has occurred over the last couple of decades towards trying to redress this and rebalance it. But the key message at this point is that we're working on a big regional span with vast complex networks of interactions in a challenging ecology with ecological diversity. Thank you, Marco. There we go. And so the Indus is sitting in this big area. It covers 2 rivers, one of them's perennial, one of them's annual. We've got multiple ecozones, including deserts, floodplains, foothills, mountains, coasts, salt pans, it goes on. And 2 rainfall systems, the winter and the monsoonal rainfall. And as Cameron mentioned last week, we can talk about this rainfall as being predictably unpredictable, and he did a much better job of explaining what that means. There's also a diversity of climate zones, and that's key as well to some of the discussions we can have around this diversity into agriculture as well, the potentials for what people could do. And we're going to stick mainly to some of the mature Harappan side of things, but we will get into the implications of the late Harappan period. So it's worth remembering we have a climate change event around about 4.2K, but I'm not going to go into the details of what this is because that's highly complex. And we had a whole hour talk last week on the details of this. But all of this is to say that there's going to be some influence on Indus agricultural choices, because it is a vast zone and there's lots of potential here. So as archaeobotanists, we're constantly having to think about the richness that could be happening in the data set, but also the preservation states that it could turn up in. And we're not going to go too much into that. So that's something that could again come up in the question and answer. Thank you, Marco. Now, when it comes to understanding the Indus, the focus hasn't really been on this diversity until recently. At the urban height of the Indus, it tended to be focusing more on that, on those urban, the urban period was very short-lived. I'm getting ahead of myself. The urban period was very short-lived. It was made of these 5 large sites and thousands of small sites. And we have very little evidence of things like centralized control, but we have a plethora of material. And while it was originally described as being homogeneous, we now know that there's a lot of local variation underlying this. And this is one of the reasons the Indus is so interesting. We have this discussion around how we have homogeneity, but also diversity underlying it. Thank you. But one of the things that has happened as a result of the way that Indus archaeology has developed is that there has been a tendency to focus on these urban spaces, these so-called cities, and on the weird structures that are within them, things like the Great Bath or the Stupa. Since the earliest excavations, there's been this weird scholarly attention that's been imbalanced towards the hunt for elites and trying to understand this, or what is the evidence for veneration of individuals and how does this reflect in the Indus? And there's been less sort of focus on other aspects, perhaps, although again, this is being rebalanced in recent years. Thank you, Marco. And one of the influences of this city-focused archaeology does start to come through into archaeobotany and have a dramatic impact on it over the long term. So after this brief preamble of the ecology, we can start to get into some of the influences on the archaeobotany. The earliest excavations are predominantly at urban sites like Harappan and Mohenjo-daro. And this is where we see even the beginnings of archaeobotanical interest, because the excavators discover food items. These are mostly hand collected, so things that are seen with the naked eye and picked up. At Mohenjo-daro, at Chanadaro and Harappa, we see people like Stapp, Luthra, Burtz, Vats and Shaw all reporting the discovery of seeds. And these include several different things: wheat, barley, field pea, dates, sesame and melon, and a few other things as well. But immediately the interest centres on the wheat and the barley, the cereal grains, pretty much to the exclusion of the other things. And the focus also becomes on things like the size of those grains and explorations of how this fits in with questions around the domestication and how that links to the Near East, or how surplus links to the urban story over there. Thank you, Marco. And this culminates in some of the seminal works that we see early on. So people like Wheeler and Pigott, and even as far back as Marshall, we see discussions around how these grains fit in to modelling the Indus. So Marshall actually states, great cities with teeming populations like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa could never come into being save in a country that's capable of producing food on a big scale. And it's wheat and barley that are highlighted as this critical food resource. Wheeler and Pigott pick up on the idea of agricultural production, specifically those grains, as, quote, the principal sources of wealth underpinning Indus social organisation. They describe them as levying taxes and tolls on the grains, municipal control of them, and even highlight possible granary structures. Now, there's a whole debate about whether these are granaries or not, and a lot of evidence for or against this. But the underpinning of an urban-centric economic system is hypothesized based on the presence of those grains. And agriculture is envisioned as winter, rabi-based, using wheat and barley, these large grains. And through them, comparisons to Egypt and Mesopotamia are made. Models of surplus and urbanism are created with an easily transplantable idea of whether or not they are similar to the Near East and the Near Eastern Bronze Age. And this has had a long influence, either as a model or something to be pushed back against. Now, it's obviously been highly critiqued, not just because of the comparisons with Sumer, for example. We get people like Fairservice critiquing it very early on, through critiques of things like the issues around irrigation, but also farming and urbanism. But it's also been pointed out that the Indus is environmentally diverse. We have summer crops, and we have to question these rabi homogeneous models. Thank you, Marco. But some of this sort of urban-centric archaeology and the origins of agricultural interest from this early point onwards creeps into the models that have developed. And this is because for a long time, our data has come from only one or two well-sampled sites. and in particular the assemblage from Harappa, excavated from the 80s into the 2000s and analysed by Professor Steve Webber. This has become the most widely accepted construct for Indus agricultural systems, simply because it has for a long time been one of the best data sets we have. And in this model, what we see is that in the early period, there should be barley. This is the winter crop. It is processed at a household level in an extensive agricultural system. It shifts in the mature Harappan period towards wheat, another winter crop, and this is centralized in its processing and grown intensively. These two crops are part of this urbanization structure and the support of urban systems. And then we get a change towards the late Harappan period. We start to see shifts towards millet inclusion, the mixing of winter and summer crops, these kharif crops like millet. And things start to decentralize and de-intensify. And post the Indus, the introduction of rice and a focus more on the summer cropping and the household. And we're not quite sure in these models whether it's extensive or intensive. So this is the model that develops based around this particular assemblage of Harappa and becomes extended outwards, with one particular caveat, and that's Gujarat, which is described as a different system, one that is millet-based. And this again is from a highly sampled assemblage, Rojdi, done by, again by Professor Webber in the 1980s, and then supported by work at places like Rio Timbo and Babakot. This is a millet-based assemblage, different from the Harappa assemblage. And it becomes entangled into models that are covering the Indus, one that is broadly described as core and periphery. Sindh and Punjab form the core, where wheat and rabi crops are found, extrapolating that Harappa data set and this early material from places like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, and compared with the periphery, Gujarat, Rajasthan, Haryana, where a mixed or rabi kharif type cropping is seen based on the Rojdi and other data sets. And this model for a long time becomes the norm, mainly because it's based on the best data sets we have. Thank you, Marco. However, it's always noted, even within the model created by Professor Webber in his 2003 paper, that the Indus was complex, socially, economically, and environmentally, and that more work has to be done to refine this big model. It is just a model. And in all these papers, they suggest that we have to explore the subtlety of agricultural systems, move beyond broad brush economic modeling and start thinking about the nuances, spatially, chronologically, think about networks of people, sites, ecologies, foodways. And we see this in many works, from Webber to Fuller to Vishnumitra, Savithri, Sarasvat, Pakaria, Marco, and many others. I can't go into all the names. So what we're doing in this paper is to continue this work, to summarize it and show how we got to this dominant model and how we can and are, as the collective archaeobotanical community, moving to refine it, not replace it, just refine it. And I'll hand over to Marco at this point.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. And at this point, I connect back to what is our tradition of work, archaeobotany. Archaeobotany has a long global history, and it has originated from mostly Europe and Near East, but it has actually a very deep history also in South Asia. And it has its unique trajectory, and that's very, very interesting. Professor Fuller summed up a little bit his view about what were the various phases of archaeobotany in South Asia. And basically, as an initial phase, which was the consulting paleobotanist phase, in which basically botanists were brought in to look at seeds that were excavated. The professional archaeobotanist phase, in which there were people that were at that point trained as archaeobotanists, coming from archaeology and working with the excavator to collect and study the materials. And then in the recent past, the self-critical archaeobotany phase. And we fundamentally are now in a situation in which we are also adding a reflexive perspective onto this. And this is because we see a lot of discussion around the nature of the data creation. So up to very recently, the work was to collect the data, to interpret the data. What is very interesting now is that we have a situation in which we start to discuss what is the nature of the data we are dealing with. And one thing that is very clear is that we have a lot of data in South Asia, contrary to what is very often said, that we are poor of data. That's not true. We have a lot of data, and that data allows for a lot of discussion, for bigger discussion. Obviously, that does not mean that we don't have holes that needs to be filled in. And that's, in a sense, what should be our next step. In terms of what we have, there are 63 sites that have been sampled within the Indus Valley Civilization for archaeobotanical remains. It is true that they represent only 10% the known Indus site. However, that's not such a bad news in the sense that they also represent half of the excavated site, and that's a very good news. We have that basically half of the site that have been excavated, we have some information related to archaeobotany. However, we have a problem with the sampling. The sampling strategies, unfortunately, have been inconsistent, and that's fundamentally what we see is that out of the 63 sites, only 30 use flotation, and then 19 fully quantify the data. 10 has a rough quantification of the data, and 6 of the site had no taxed identification. So as you can see, there is a little bit of a mix in here. And again, we don't want to be negative about it. It's simply what we have, and we need to live with it and use it. But as we were saying, there is an interesting amount of data that can be used and can be dealt with. Now, flotation, systematic flotation, and the use of small mesh is a key point for our work in the field and for the collection of the data. Flotation was first done by Kajale in South Asia, and quickly moved also to be employed on settlement of the Indus Valley. Flotation dramatically increased the amount of information, both in terms of the amount of material we can recover and the amount of species. So not only how much is coming out, but also the diversity that is coming out is augmenting. However, if we don't implement flotation in a systematic way, we have some problem. We have some problem with the overall data set when we look at the big data set. Because if flotation is not applied in a systematic way, we are not able to then compare the data set in the proper way. And so we need to ensure that the models are built on evenly spread data. What that means that we also need to cover in a more uniform and homogeneous way the area of the Indus Valley. And that is very important. For instance, we assume, as Jennifer was saying, that Sindh is characterized by wheat and barley, simply because in Mohenjo-Daro, wheat and barley was recovered because what was collected, what was seen during the excavation. There was no flotation going on at Mohenjo-Daro. And all the smaller seeds probably were missed because they were simply not seen. So we need to have an extension of where flotation is operated, but also we need to have a standardization of how we do flotation, and we need to use a fine mesh every time we do flotation, because the fine mesh will allow to recover all the spectrum of the seeds that we want to look at. And indeed, when we use a smaller mesh, and when we also make it explicit of what is the mesh we've been using, we see that quantifying and reporting our data becomes much more comparable. And when flotation is applied, we're able to recover a level of details that can open up really a lot our interpretation and our understanding and knowledge about what people during the Indus civilization were using, cultivating and using. For instance, with flotation, we are able to collect small seeded plant like millets, but also we are able to collect, like in this image, small size seed coats that are incredibly useful for the identification at lower taxonomic level. So flotation, in a sense, and the evenly application of flotation when we do excavation is an important methodological step to be able to augment the data set that we have, the big data set we already have, but we want more, obviously. At the same time, in the last few years, we saw that the Indus archaeobotany has been implementing new methods to explore different contexts and to gather different data sets. So we've seen an increased use of phytolith analysis, of starch, and also of residue analysis on pottery. And in this case, it would be very important that the community working in the Indus will come together to discuss protocol for sampling strategies. Sampling strategies that are keeping in mind that they are taking into consideration the diversity of the analysis that can be done. And analysis that very often are cross-disciplinary and cross-proxy. It means that very often maybe ourselves are not totally knowledgeable about it, but when we come together as a group, we can exchange that knowledge and we can create a way for sampling that is much more full in its approach. And Jennifer also would like to have a plea for pollen analysis, more pollen analysis done. Indeed, the area of the Indus Valley is not the best area for pollen. Pollen preservation is really quite bad, but indeed, it would be one more proxy, and it would be extremely interesting to have that kind of information in that respect. But as a general thing, the Indus archaeobotany has seen a lot of exciting new methodology applied over the last year. And it started with work also by Weber, Kashyap, Jennifer herself, and many other people that really brought in many different perspectives. Now, so what we can do is also looking at how sampling strategy has been able to amplify the data set. And in here, we bring together just a simple example from a project that was developed in Gujarat. It was the Northern Gujarat Archaeological project with Professor Ajit Prasad that I see him at the moment listening to the presentation. And here, we've been working on a set of Mesolithic and Anartha sites, including Loteshwar, Baharbotimbo, and Datrana. And the archaeobotanical work that has been carried out has been multi-focused and has been looking, the sampling strategy put together flotation, but also sample pottery and grinding stones and general sediments for a battery of different analyses. And fundamentally, what we were curious to understand was the adaptation to a climatic variability in a semi-arid environment over basically 7,000 years. And through a consistent strategic sampling approach, we've been able to compare the site, and we've been able to also gather information that very often hasn't been there. And we've been able fundamentally to see how there was a very varied exploitation of different types of crops and wild plants. And you can see in here some of the examples. There were several millets that were exploited, but also Macrotyloma uniflorum. But then we see, for instance, also the evidence from the starch, as we can see on the right-hand side of the slides. And so we were able to construct, without going too much into detail, we were able to construct the story of the exploitation of plant resources over a long period of time, and to compare that strategy between different type of site, both in hunter-gatherer and in early agriculturalist.
Okay, so I'm going to take over again.
Yes, again you are.
Thank you. So we have all of this material historically in this data set from 63 sites. But one of the challenges that we face as well is how do we communicate between archaeobotanists before we even start communicating it through to the archaeologists? And an area that's been historically a challenge for us as a community has been something called taxonomic nomenclature. So I'm back here getting technical for you. So for the non-archaeobotany, zooarchaeology people in the Zoom, taxonomy is the practice of classification and nomenclature is the practice of naming. So these are aspects of our identification process that might sound very trivial, but are actually quite critical, because this is how we give it the correct name and are able to discuss it as colleagues without causing confusion. If we give something the wrong name, we can almost make it impossible to compare data sets. So to give us a nice example for this, we all know what erd bean and mung bean look like, black gram and green gram. But the problem with this is that the names of things can shift. So we use Latin in our naming systems, but Latin names can change over time. And this can cause some serious problems. So I'm going to use the example of Daulatpur, an old report of Daulatpur, to really illustrate this. So we have in this older report for Daulatpur something called Phaseolus mungo, noted in the late Harappan period. There's very little description of what it is and no images. So the seeds that you can see at the top of the screen are from another site just for illustrative purposes. In the actual report, there's almost no description and no images for us to work with. Phaseolus mungo is an older name for something that has now been moved into a new naming system, Vigna. But the problem is that when they moved it, they split it into two different things, Vigna mungo and Vigna radiata. These are two separate things. One of them is black gram and one of them is green gram. So we have almost no way of working out what at Daulatpur the Phaseolus mungo is referring to. Is this black gram or green gram? Is this Vigna mungo or is this Vigna radiata? The thing at Daulatpur remains as a confusing object for archaeobotanists. And it might sound trivial, but this is really important for modelling because they have different ecological zones, different growth habits, different food tastes. So there's lots of things that could become a problem if we can't work out what this Phaseolus mungo actually is. Thank you, Marco. Next slide. And one of the areas, one of the things that we could do to try and solve this is to use something called a flora. This is a record of all the plants in a region with the currently, at time of the flora is published, accepted names. So the flora that we've got on the screen there is the Flora of British India by Hooker. And you can see there that he's describing what Phaseolus mungo is at the time, because that was the accepted name. And he's saying that this is named by Linnaeus. And if we know that, we can kind of work our way forwards and try and figure out whether it was black gram or green gram. But without knowing what flora they're using and how it's being described and what's being talked about, we're a little bit stuck to do this investigative work. And this is the second problem. We've got the naming problem on one hand, we've got a second problem for our region. There isn't a flora for our region, realistically speaking. The closest we have is this Flora of British India from the 1880s, or the online Flora of Pakistan, which understandably doesn't cover the entire area. Now, I don't have a solution for this yet. I've tried both options using the Flora of Pakistan and the Flora of British India. At the moment, I'm testing out whether we can use the Flora of British India, combine it with the Flora of Pakistan, and then work forward with an online naming tool. But it's complicated and difficult, and I have to record every step I take so that the next person isn't confused by me. So I'd welcome suggestions on how to deal with this, what sounds like a tedious technical problem, but is really important because it's making some of our lives quite difficult to compare our data sets. Thank you, Marco. But putting aside this technical point, and we actually look into this data set, into these 63 sites that are reporting material, what do we actually have in the Indus? Well, we have a lot of material. It's more than just the rabi crops found at the initial Indus excavations, Harappan, Mohenjo-daro, Tranodaro. And that's not a surprise. In fact, it's a huge straw man. We already know, for example, from work at Harappa that was done in the 2000s, that there is diversity in this assemblage. So it's not a boogeyman to say that the Harappa model is wrong. We're simply showing its expansion and nuancing. From the work done by the many, many archaeobotanists in this region, we've always known how diverse the Indus was. But it's when it's put in total numbers that I think it becomes truly remarkable how rich our civilization-wide assemblage is. There are 339 accessioned taxa, accessioned plant things. That is huge compared to any other region of the world, really. We can break it down into 54 families. Families are things like the grass family, the bean family, the daisy family, 54 of them. And within that, 148 genera. This is a huge data set that we can really be proud of as Indus archaeologists and Indus archaeobotanists. We have got so much material to work with. Thank you, Marco. And not all of this is economic material. We've got a lot of things in there that we might consider to be weed crops or wild things, which is very exciting for doing things like crop processing modeling, ecological modeling. But we've also got a lot of things that could have economic properties. So things that are consumable by humans or animals as fodder or food, and also things that humans could use for things like fibers, wood resources. And that all sort of changes depending on what we would class as being a usable resource, because just because we think it's usable doesn't mean that somebody in the past was using it. Let's not get into the utilitarian discussions today. But what we do see across this data set are cereals, pulses, fruits, nuts, gourds, squashes, fiber crops, oil crops, and I've left off wood and possible medicinals just to keep this little table visible. And what this table actually shows is really just the things that are ubiquitous in the data set, repeating over and over again at the sites where we have material. And each one of these has a unique story about how it arrives into the Indus, how it's being used in the Indus, and we just can't go through all of them here, which is a shame because they are really interesting. So what we're going to do is pick up a few of these stories and play with them. And perhaps an interesting and useful place to start is the wheat and the barley story. And we can focus on maybe the end of the wheat and the barley story rather than how it gets to the Indus. Because there's that discussion in that model of the shift from a rabi system to a Kharif system or a mixed system in the late Harappan period that lines up with some discussions around the impacts of the late Harappan or the 4.2K change or the late Harappan economic changes. Because it's suggested that with the social and climate shifts that are happening late mature Harappan and into the late Harappan period, that we have an accompanying economic shift. And this is the idea of an agricultural revolution that we see in multiple works. The idea is that we have an early establishment of wheat and barley that kind of either drives urbanization or is part of urbanization and then supports urbanism. But in the late Harappan period, there's this supposed shift, the late Harappan revolution, in which Kharif crops, particularly the millets and large millets, grow in importance. And while they're not suggested to supplant the existing systems, these new crops that are traditionally found in the more marginal areas, the periphery, according to these models, start being used in core areas like Sindh and Punjab due to climatic shifts, riverine shifts. It depends on the version of the model you read. And these new agricultural practices and crops lead to new socio-economic relationships. The system becomes imbalanced enough that it breaks down, and we see people moving to live in what used to be less profitable regions agriculturally. Now, there are lots of problems with this theory, and we can explore those in the Q&A, and it will become apparent, especially when we get to African crops in a moment. But it's with the nuancing simply of the agricultural systems that we can play around with this and really show that it's not that simple. So one of the things we can highlight here is how variable this supposed shift actually is. We can look at how at some sites it's really extreme and others it isn't. Now, of course, in this model, this is supposedly a shift from Rabi to Kharif happening within the core area. And we can look down in Gujarat and simply see how this doesn't even work there in an area that's supposed to be Kharif cropping all the time. We can see this in works like Kisara and Kanma, work done by Beccaria and colleagues. At Kisara, we see a shift not towards sort of like increased amounts of Kharif on an already Kharif cropping system, but a site that is predominantly Rabi in an area that should be Kharif. In the mature Harappan period, we have a significant proportion of barley in the mature Harappan period. And then in an area that's already arid, it switches over to being this millet base in the late Harappan. This is doing everything that the core should be doing, but it's in the periphery. And Beccaria says that this is a really good example of this late Harappan change, this reaction to the shifting winter moisture available that is there in the early part of the mature Harappan, but is changing towards the late mature Harappan and is gone in that late Harappan period. And there are similar data in Kanma. And this just really doesn't fit with this model that we have of a late Harappan agricultural revolution happening in the core, because it's out in the periphery. Thank you, Marco. And we can contrast this staying in Gujarat with other sites, places like Shikarpur, Orio-Timbo, Babakot, Rojdi, where we don't see this shift. We've got diversity in what's happening. There we see the continuation of Kharif cropping, rather than these stark shifts that we're seeing that observed by Beccaria at Kanma and Kisara. At Rojdi, for example, which is shown here, Weber observed continual use of millets. But underlying this are these subtle little changes in what millets are used and when, shifts from growing Eleusine and Panicum towards a more focus on one crop, and then back to this mixed cropping over the periods. And we could think again about Harappa and look at what Weber actually says about his model. Yes, there is an introduction or a slight increase in the amount of millet in the late Harappan period, but it's only 7%. So these little subtle differences across the Indus are starting to break down this idea of a barley, wheat, and then a late Harappan agricultural revolution. And it's that kind of nuancing that is really key to the archaeobotanical goals, I would suggest, of our current field.
Thank you. So beyond the story that has been, in a sense, the protagonist for many papers and many models, we have also other crops, the millets, that somehow we think that can be useful to highlight some of the trends that we see in the archaeobotany in the Indus. And millets are a very difficult crop to work with. First of all, millet is a work that describes a group of plants that are brought together. They are plants that are not even related taxonomically. They have seeds that tendentially are small, but not necessarily. There are some that have bigger seeds. And the only thing that brings them all together, they're all grasses. And that's it, fundamentally. But there is another thing that is very interesting. They're also very well adapted to little water during their life cycle. So these are the two main characteristics. And I'll say millet can be divided in small millet or big millet. And we have a quick look at a couple of examples for this to show you how in the Indus this crop play a role, and how the entire vision is quite complicated. So big millets, in this case sorghum and pearl millet, have a long history of debate in the Indus archaeology. They are both non-native of South Asia, and instead they come from Africa. This has led to suggestion that they represent an influx of non-native material, and specifically that this is a part of a later Harappan revolution in the agricultural system. Again, the same view. It changes, we go from the C3 wheat and barley to other crops that are coming from a different geographical area, and that they are incorporated into the agricultural strategies of the Indus. However, this story and the data is a bit more complex. So it remains very controversial. Early null at around 2400 BC are seen by some practitioner, for example, Fuller and Stevens in a paper in 2018, as problematic due to the lack of direct dating on these grains and the lack of contextual information associated to them. One of the key things with the millets is also that they tend to travel quite a lot in the sediment. So if we don't date directly the seeds, sometimes the interpretation could be a little bit difficult. The same can be said for the earlier Harappan finds at Rohira by Saraswat and at Banawali by Lone at 1887. Various later Harappan finds are, in Fuller's and Casual's opinion, more secure and placing the movement of sorghum into South Asia around the second millennium, stepping into Gujarat. So Gujarat is the stepping stone to enter into South Asia. This includes later Harappan finds of 63 grains at Kanmer that were published by Pokhari in 2011. However, there are also some mature Harappan finds with Kirsara being the most notable case. So we see that there is a very diverse assemblage in here. However, the images in Kirsara show a very poor preserved grains, and Pokhari note that it should be more cautiously called sorghum CFB color to denote of the concern over the identification. And only a single grain was noted in earlier context in the same site. So again, what we see, it's an assemblage with some problem and also an unclear date of when we start to have millets, at least big grain millets, fully established in the archaeological assemblage of South Asia. So what we can say at the moment is that as a conservative perspective, we can say that the most secure is to say that at least by the early second millennium BC, we have sorghum present in South Asia. Gujarat appears to be where the most of sorghum finds are located. There are some exceptions outside Gujarat, but requires a little bit more work to confirm the identification, the dates, and the stratigraphy, so that we see that fundamentally they seem to be mostly confined on the southern periphery. And let me change. Per millet, the other big grain millet, has an equally debated story in South Asia. Manning et al. Suggest that pearl millet appears in South Asia by or shortly after 2000 BC, mainly in Gujarat and Saurashtra first, and then eventually expand farther north. The environmental condition in this region would have been ideal for its cultivation. They mimic the semi-arid condition of Africa, where pearl millet grows naturally. The later Harappan finds of a single grain of Penisatum or pearl millet at Babarkot support this, as does a recent finds of 2 grains of pearl millets at Kirsara. They at 4,100, 3,900 BP. So the find from Kirsara is also associated by an illustration that shows a very poorly preserved grain, implying that this should perhaps at most should be included as Penisatum CF glaucum, or even perhaps just look at Penisatum. We think it's Penisatum. We don't go farther than that fundamentally. The same can be said for 2 mature Harappan grains, and maybe even for quite a bigger quantities, more than 100 later Harappan grains found in Kanmer. That in theory, this will push the crop farther back in time. So it is the case that with later Harappan genus level identification grain at Mazubtub, the work that has been done by Jennifer, could tentatively be identified to genus level. We have Penisatum and we stop in there, possibly. But again, they are not the best of the grain to work with. So in general, the Indus finds of pennisatum are problematic. And similarly to sorghum, but even more in a sense because the seeds are even smaller, so even more complicated when they are broken. It is safe to suggest that they are most securely dated at the second millennium, but even those finds need to be revisited. We need to go back, really look at the material. So sorghum and pearl millet are not common finds, not found in large numbers, say for later Harappan Khmer, and do not seem to have been staples of the Indus diet, even in the second millennium Gujarat, beyond this single site. So again, difficult to say that it's a revolution of later Harappan. And let me see in here. So beyond the debate of the big grains, the big millet, grain millet, and the debate about when the millet arrives, there is also an interesting discussion that happened after they arrived. So what happened to this millet once they arrived in South Asia? And this is very interesting and very important for the discussion related to agriculture in South Asia, the agency of South Asian peasants, and what they did with these new crops. What we see, for instance, that over time there are changes in the grain shape. Specifically, in this case, we are talking about pennisatum, and we see that there is a shift in grains with which are more apically thick, and then have a more club-shaped general grain. This increase in thickness to breadth ratio appears to have been a delayed development. If West African and South Asian specimens from the second and the first millennia are compared, the West African accession appear to be smaller than those in South Asia, with South Asian samples showing change over time towards the larger and more club-like type of shape. Fuller uses this early find from Surkotada at around 1700 BC to demonstrate that the earlier arrival of pearl millet into South Asia were of the smaller variety, and that over time, as we took towards finds in the Ganges at sites like Naran, dated at 1400 BC, we see the development of more club form type of seeds and also bigger dimension. Fuller thinks that this is the development of our plowing in South Asia, and this is the byproduct of our plowing on the pearl millet, and compare it with the absence of our plowing in northeastern Africa. And so these changes in pearl millet are possibly related to changes in agricultural technology. So this is very interesting, and it's very interesting, as we were saying, to discuss fundamentally the changes in agricultural technique in the Indus. While large millet have been used as evidence of later Harappan agricultural revolution, debate which has been largely set up now for other evidence, and the grain themselves do not actually support it for the various reasons we've been discussed up to now. When we move to the small millets, we see that there is another debate occurring in the archaeobotany of the Indus. This is not for model building, strictly speaking, but again, for very, very basic reason that needs to be sorted out. How do we securely recover and identify them? So in here, we have a very practical also problem in a sense. The small grains are difficult. They have difficult taphonomical pathway. They tend to, as I was saying before, move a lot in the sediments. They break down a lot, and unless we use small mesh flotation, we are not going to recover these seeds. So our models of a millet-based periphery and non-millet-based core could simply be down to a differential sampling practices, or where flotation has been done, with what kind of mesh, and where flotation hasn't been done. If we look at the map in this side, we also see that a lot of the work with flotation has been done in the periphery. And therefore, in the periphery, we probably have a higher collection of small seeds, while in the core area, there is much less flotation going on. There has been, at least. And therefore, the data that we have probably is suffering from that kind of bias. Finally, we also see that small millets are a category that is painful to handle in terms of identification, just to add more problem to the problem that are already there. We can take, for instance, the example of Eleusine coracana. Eleusine coracana is finger millet. It has this shape, and the floral part looks like a hand. And fundamentally, again, the Eleusine origin has been an ongoing debate between if it's either South Asian or African. And but the main thing is also adding problem in terms of the genetics and the morphometric of the seeds that has been developed in the last 10 years, probably a bit less, have shown that fundamentally there is a strong suggestion that is fundamentally an African crop. But again, it's interesting to see how fundamentally we see that this kind of problem of identification, then understanding when it arrives in South Asia, it really a key point in the archaeobotany of South Asia. So just to go a little bit deeper with the Eleusine, while a lot of research has been done securing the generic fingerprint and thus the origin of Eleusine in Africa, little archaeobotanical research has been done in Africa itself, and instead there has been a great deal of focus of work in South Asia. Again, the finds are problematic, and because fundamentally a lot of the material of small millets that have been found in South Asia very often has been dumped into finger millet. And this has created a problem because fundamentally that importance might not reflect the reality of the presence of the crop in South Asia. Fuller and others have argued, for instance, that finger millet identification might be incorrect for many examples and many works. And so we need to go back and look at that material that has been identified in the past with fundamentally a little bit more tools that have been developed lately in time, looking for instance at the embryo dimensions and looking also at the husk surface pattern to be able that we are really identifying correctly the Eleusine. And that's a key thing that is pending. An example in here, for instance, if we go a little bit more in detail, we have that result in many small hide millets possibly being called Eleusine, where actually they were something else. For example, the finds of Eleusine coracana in late Harappan Surcotada are more likely Setaria italica with maybe some general Setaria and no further identification than that. In Shikarpur, mature Harappan, also we had identification of Eleusine coracana that has been reinterpretaria again. At Ulas, again the same pattern, re-identification as generally Setaria. And so because of this, it is difficult to both date the arrival of this African millet and to understand the role of the native versus African millets in the Indus. So fundamentally, we need to really go back to this material, but also we really need to go back to the original material, not only to the photographs as the one we are showing at the moment in here, because the photographs have several problems. One, the quality of the photograph. Two, the photograph represents 1, 2, or 3 seeds in the entire assemblage. So we don't really know how much in there is that has been correctly identified. Now we're going to focus a little bit at some example of work that have been done by Jennifer and myself over the last years in Sindh and in Haryana, to show how, when we are able to go deeper in the identification, we do the flotation, we are able to have a much better understanding of the assemblage. An example is Bando Kubo in Sindh, in the main Indus floodplains, where we floated basically all the context, quite a lot of materials. And if we look, I'm going to go a little bit fast because I see that we are a little bit late, and I want to leave some time also to Jennifer. What we see in here, that fundamentally the story of wheat and barley, it's very different. And this is a core area site, and that goes from late early to mature Harappan. And what we see is, yes, a raise of the wheat and barley, the green bars and arrows in there, and a diminishing of the millets. But what we see is also a lot of millets from still in the late early and during the early mature period, and still millet is present in parallel with the with wheat and barley. So a story that is very different from what we have from the earliest model. When we look at other proxy, what is interesting that these other proxies, for example, like in this case, starch from grinding stones, mimic in a very almost photocopy way what we see from the grains. We have a lowering of the millet, but we don't have a disappearance of the millets. And again, when we look at the phytolith, again, we have the same story. So what is telling this? What is telling us all this? Is telling us that if three different proxy are telling us the same story, this is a very strong story. So we need to start thinking that the core of the Indus was not dominated by wheat and barley. The story was different. Millets were there. Millet were there at the early phases, but millet were there also during the mature Harappan. We don't have the late Harappan in here, so maybe there is something different in the late, but definitely not during the mature Harappan. And the same situation, or very similar situation, we have it in another site, which is Talurjabit, also in this case at the edge between the desert and the Indus plain. But we have, again, very similar story in which we see wheat and barley going up during from the early to the mature. In this case, it's within the mature, and the millet slightly diminishing. And at this point, I leave it back to Jennifer with the rice.
Thank you. So as I know that we're short on time, I won't linger too much on this, but I wanted to try and move us away just from the wheat and the barley and the millet story into some of the other things we have in the Indus. And perhaps one of the most controversial archaeobotanical topics we have has been rice. Now, I'm going to avoid diving too much into the domestication side of this topic for a couple of reasons. One, it's a story that is predominantly happening in the Ganges. We do have an Indus domestication aspect to this. But secondly, the genetics of rice are a mess. And I have spent months trying to get my head around this. And thirdly, I have a project that's ongoing to try and work all of this out, and therefore have lots and lots of material and can spend hours talking about it. And we don't have the time. What I'll say here before I get into some of the discussion, though, is that we have this whole debate in the Indus that has gone on for a long time, back and forth, about whether or not the Indus people were using rice at all. And this is based around both the material evidence, but also around some of the discussions relating to biogeography, to that domestication story. And we have various quotes, and I'm going to be gentle here because I've been pre-warned. We have a quote that has often been recited many times, that says that rice was available as a crop but not adopted, and there is no evidence as yet to believe it was an important crop. Now, this was based at a time when the evidence was still being disputed and argued about, and I think we're at the point now where we can say this can be put to bed as an argument. And the reason that it was an argument is because there is this whole domestication argument happening in the Ganges, and it kind of spills over into the Indus, because the Indus isn't an area that we see having wild rice available. Marco, can you show the next slide for me? Thank you. So we have this sort of area that doesn't really have wild rice currently available. So how would Indus people access rice to use it and either domesticate it or not? If the Gangetic peoples have got domesticated rice, are they trading it into the Indus? And that domestication story isn't settled. So we've got this problematic biogeographic data because the Green Revolution and other things haven't really helped us to understand this. Things have changed. Modern wild rice doesn't represent Indus times wild rice distributions. And then this domestication story isn't settled, so we don't know what's being traded backwards and forwards. And on top of this, the actual evidence in the Indus was very difficult to unpick to begin with. The earliest evidence is for impressions on grains in ceramics. These were found in Gujarat and Rajasthan, but these are difficult to use because impressions aren't really necessarily the best reflection of the actual material because of changes in the way that things are fired, and it just makes even genus level identifications really difficult. Thank you, Marco. Since some of these earlier discussions, and even sort of more recently, rice has now become quite a common find. Rice grains have been found at early and mature Harappan Balu, early Harappan Kunal, mature Harappan Banawali, late Harappan Hulas, but always in relatively small numbers. And this has also been the case at Kanma, and I'm going to mention Kanma again in a moment. We've also got them at Harappa, Rangpur, Farmana and Perak, and supported at Harappa with phytolith data, which potentially pushes the presence back to the mature Harappan. And one of the things that I found when I was working on the land water settlement project, led by Cameron Petrie and Professor Ravindranath Singh, were a large number of grains. So we do have grains present in the Indus. But one of the critiques has always been of rice, and also some of the other kharif crops, so the millets and tropical pulses, for example, has been the dating. That has been the big critique. Yeah, they might well be there, but are you sure that they're not just late Harappan, part of this late Harappan revolution? Prove that they are in the mature and the early phases and not contamination. So this has been this sort of critique that continually, thank you, Marco, continually happens over and over again. We see it coming up in many, many papers, a critique of the dating of them. So for example, we have at Banawali the presence of rice that was placed in the Indus period, but that dating is based on the ceramics in the context and radiocarbon dates on wheat and barley in that context, not the rice itself. And as Marco mentioned, we know that grains can percolate up and down layers, so we have to really get direct dates. And we see this being a problem at other sites outside of the Indus as well. So Giedra Matevjevic, and I apologize to Giedra for mispronouncing her surname, but she has shown that millets can move really significantly. We're talking through contexts that date thousands of years, moving up and down these profiles. So if you don't have the direct dates, this is why people are arguing about it. Marco. Yeah, there we are. And just to really prove this point about the rice, the first real direct dating of rice that was done in the Indus was done at Kanma by Bakaria and his team. So these were rice grains found in layers that were Harappan according to the ceramics and all the other radiocarbon dating. But the grains themselves of rice and a couple of other cereals showed that things were moving up and down the profile. And the rice itself provided dates in the ranges of AD 321 through to AD 425. So these rice grains are not Indus in date, they are contaminants that have moved through the profile. So in order to prove that any rice that we have, and indeed any kharif crops that are not in the early and mature, not in the late Harappan phase, are in the early and mature, really has to be directly dated just to deal with this naysaying that has traditionally occurred in the Indus. And this is one of the things that the Land Water Settlement Project set out to do. It was to date directly any evidence of kharif crops from its sites. And at Masudpur 1 and Masudpur 7 in Haryana, we had the opportunity to do this. So in a paper that was published in 2016, Petrie et al., we report the dates that we have from 27 of the samples sent out to the Oxford Radiocarbon Acceleration Unit. And the dated material includes millets, so that's Echinocloa colonna and Soteria pumila, so these two small millets, rice, mung bean, so Vigna radiata, erd bean, Vigna mungo, horse gram, and also some barley, some wheat, and some winter pulses. So we get both the Rabi and the Kharif dating. And the dates that come back place all of this material squarely in the early, the mature, and into the late Harappan. There are a couple of contaminant dates that make sense stratigraphically when you look at the profile. So this is really nice, direct evidence that we do in fact have early, mature, and late Harappan use of Kharif crops, including the rice in the Indus. And at these sites in particular, we have large numbers of rice grains. Now, I'm not going to get into the fact that we also at this site have spikelet bases that suggests that the Indus might have been part of an agricultural niche that was possibly domesticating that rice. There's some interesting and weird things happening there because, as I say, we need to really sort out the Gangetic Proto-Indica debate first. But there's something interesting happening in the Indus that may be a little bit separate and genetically unusual going on, leading to a localized domestication of rice, shown in the spikelet bases. And that was made possible by fine mesh flotation. Thank you, Marco. But one thing that we can pick up on, speaking of domestication, are some of the really cool, fascinating new waves of scientific discoveries and methods that we, the archaeobotanical community, are spearheading. We see these new techniques pushing our debates forward in multiple different ways. And I like this example, which is the last crop I'm going to pick up on before one piece of theoretical advancement that's happening. And this is some work done by Fuller and Murphy on pulse domestication. Now, there's lots of candidate pulses within South Asia that we know are native South Asian pulses, beans, that are domesticated within South Asia. But the debate about when and where this happens is always rumbling on. And the one I'm picking up here is the horse gram debate. There's lots of discussions around how and when this happened, but when Fuller and Murphy combine the early archaeobotanical evidence, which shows up in areas like Gujarat at sites like Lateshwar, and also in the southern Deccan, it lines up very nicely with the wild distributions historically and the ecological requirements of wild horse gram. So that's really interesting, and it led to this question, maybe the Indus was a source of domestication, a hearth of domestication, but it could also be the southern Deccan. So they set out to try and work this one out. So as well as doing this mapping of the data sets and the biogeography, they looked for things like seed size change. This is kind of standard practice archaeobotanical methods, doing morphometrics and measurements. And they showed that there is indeed a statistically significant change over time and difference between the wild and the domesticated. And it happens both in the southern Deccan and in the Indus region. So one of the things they then decided might be an interesting thing to do is to have a little look at taking it a step further methodologically. Thank you, Marco. Here we are. And so what they did is they looked for something else that's usually pretty invisible archaeologically unless you do genetics. And this is dormancy. So this is part of the changes that happen during domestication. And one of its side effects is the thinning of the seed coat. So you can imagine this is almost impossible archaeologically to look at unless you happen to have access to one of these things, which is called a synchrotron, which is a very complex, big high power microscope type thing. I can't really explain it. It's not even a microscope. It bombards, it's X-ray tomography. Science over my head at this point, but it's kind of incredible because what it does is it takes thin scan images through the seed down to the cellular level. So you can measure extremely tiny changes. And they worked out that there was a statistically significant change in these different populations over time. And what it shows is, again, that there is a change over time in the beans, both in the south and in the north. So what we have are two domestication processes, one happening in southern Deccan and one happening in the Indus region. And this has now been supported by some genetic work that shows there are two genetic populations of horse gram. Now, further work is needed to bolster this data set, but it is really kind of cool that we can start getting this high level detail in on this material, and the Indus is kind of part of the lead on this kind of work. Really awesome. What I'm going to say, though, is that while amazing work is being done in the field of Indus archaeobotany to push ourselves beyond the bounds of just identifying things, making taxa lists and broad economic models, we're also, as I say, improving our methods, our identification techniques, being reflexive. But we're also working as a field to move beyond just this aspect, to start thinking about our theory. And Indus archaeobotany is moving into some really interesting theoretical angles. And we don't have time to get into all of these, but one of the things that I thought would be really fun just to end with is something that relates to a question from last week. And that was about a question about spices and fruits. Thank you, Marco. So beyond economic modelling, back up one, thank you. Beyond economic modelling, Indus archaeobotany has been thinking about cutting edge theory, for example, food. So Indus farmers are not just growing things for the sake of it, but they're growing it for a reason. And that could be things like how to trade it for economic purposes. Cameron mentioned a paper on animal trade last week, but ultimately we're thinking about the end purpose of this, and it's usually eating. And this is an area that archaeology is really developing fast. This is food waste theory. Put simply, food waste theory is trying to think about the social, cultural frameworks of why and how we eat what we do, to contextualize acts like agriculture or economics, and even basic things like cooking in a socio-cultural context. And we've got people like Sherrod pointing out that we don't eat species, we eat meals. We've got to think about the emotional aspect of food. And this is something that Indus archaeology is beginning to explore, and in new and interesting avenues. There's some cracking good examples of this. Brad Chase's work on the identity of politics of animal remains at Golodoro is one of them. There's also some really cool work on residues of mixing foods. So shout out to Aksheta Surinarayan and Kalyan Chakraborty on this. And we can't do justice to the chemistry, so I'm going to leave that there and say go read their papers. Really cool residue work. Thank you, Marco. But we see increasingly this kind of thing within archaeobotany as well. So we've got the work of Weber and Kashyap at Farmana as a really nice example of this. So using the starch grains from dental calculus in both humans and cattle, and the pottery and the stone tools, they were able to think through what was present to that species list, but then start thinking about the combinations of these. Why is it that we see repeated patterns of these particular plants being mixed together, but never mixed in other things? And why particular vessel shapes, for example, have repeated patterns? And this kind of goes to something that Levi-Strauss has said, which is that food has to be not only good to eat, but good to think. So maybe we're starting to see an insight into Indus mindsets about what is the right flavour of your food. And this kind of gets us thinking about more than just cereals and pulses. So Marco has pointed out in a paper in 2014 that Indus society constructed its bonds and relationships through alternative and less obvious ways. And maybe food is part of this, linking different social groups, identities, for example, across rural and urban divides. And one of the things that I really like to suggest is that we need to start thinking beyond just these cereals. It's not just wheat, barley, rice, and millets, and a few beans, because that would make the Indus diet extremely boring. And we know that from Farmana that they are adding in some really exciting flavors. They even mentioned mango at one point. And when we look back to that big archaeobotanical data set, where we have 339 taxa listed, there's a vast range of forgotten crops. the things that get maybe 1 or 2 lines mentioned in a paper, but generally get left behind because the wheat and the barley get whole sections. And it includes fruits, not just like the ever ubiquitous jujube, but the fact that we have 3 or 4 types of jujube in our data set. There's also dates and walnuts and grapes and pistachios, mangoes, tamarind, lemon, muskmelon, ivy gourd, Indian gooseberry, winter cherry, and even possibly banana, but that's a whole nother question about preservation. So it's incredibly diverse, and it represents a range of species that can be handled in different ways, from pickling to drying to fermenting, some that have to be stored short-term because they have small lifespans, like a melon, to long-term storage, like the nuts. Some that may have represented a seasonal addition to food, and other ones that have different transport things, like local versus long-distance potentials, that may lead to questions of value. If you can't transport it easily, does that increase its value or decrease its value? And of course, a whole range of flavor profiles, so bitter lemons versus the sweet dates. And I haven't had time to get into the spices, but I hope this at least gives you an idea that we are trying to think about this kind of thing. And one of our big tasks now is to combine all of this with our economic theory and start thinking about things like ecological locality, distance of travel, preservation potential during that travel, and how seasonality might affect that, how different trade systems, like direct or down the line, or using a cart versus walking versus boats, might impact all of that, and put together some very basic GIS models to think about how that might fit into a bigger Indus picture of who can have what and when and how. And I'll hand that back to Marco to do the last 2-ish slides.
Thank you. As you probably noticed, we start with a very, very humble beginning in which a few seeds were collected by hand. And then we are finishing with an enormous list of things like Jennifer went through about possibility and how, how we can construct models and how this model can be more complex and how we can bring in people into this model in a more complex way. We still have regional gap in the Indus, that's pretty sure. But we can still use a lot the data that is available. For instance, Cholistan is still a major gap in our understanding, in certain area of the core area, in a sense of the Indus. Sindh is partially there, still as a gap, but we've been working now for quite a few years in there, and we're trying to add more and more information. And for sure, we expect to have, data coming out from the excavation carried out in Harappan. We expect also material coming out from Brachigari or Dolavira. So those gaps are going to be slowly or less slowly filled in. So what was also interesting, summing up of our talk, is that the Indus is not the backyard of archaeobotany. It's actually exactly the opposite. It's an area where there is a lot of cutting-edge work that has been going on. And I think that part of this cutting-edge work has been going on because of the push related to sometimes the bad data we had. And so we had to be thinking laterally to add on to that. And that was really a great stimulus for a lot of people working in the Indus. One thing that I think that we want to stress is that we really need to get in the habit of taking samples. Every time we do anything, we put a trowel in the dirt. We need to take samples. We need to take samples in a standardized way. We need to use flotation, and we need to use flotation with small mesh so that our samples are full of materials for sure and comparable. And we need to report those. We need to report what we find also for beyond our own, let's say, working areas. And this is becoming the common things in the Indus archaeobotany, and this will allow us as a second step to push ourselves into new theoretical direction. And at the moment with limited data, in the future with much more of it. And we can start thinking about how archaeobotanical data can fit within broader model, like those of socioeconomic organization, cultural development, and identity building in the Indus. And with this, we leave it there. And sorry, I've been quick. And we want to thank all the institution, body, and people that allowed our research and the possibility to do so. Thank you so much to everybody, and apologies for being quite late.